Last week we looked at kind of the stage being set for the things that are going to happen this week. So I'll review that a bit. Um, Remember the Seleucid Empire is kind of going through some hard times. They have a big debt that they need to repay to Rome. They're kind of under Rome's thumb. Their military is significantly weaker than it was. And this man, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, began to reign in 175 BC. He spent several years as a well-treated hostage in Rome and took over the kingdom after his brother had been assassinated. And so now he has the responsibility to restore the glory of his kingdom. And the political situation in Israel itself is a little bit complicated. The most important person there, the most powerful person there, is the high priest. They have a secular governor who's kind of over the whole region. But when it comes to local authority, the high priest is basically the petty king over Israel. And so it's a valued position. It's a position people want to be in, even if they have no interest in the religious duties that go along with it. But originally the high priest was Onias. So Onias, the Hebrew, the traditionalist, wants to keep the law, follow the traditions. His brother is Jason, the Hellenist, the Greek-leaning brother. He wants to adopt Greek culture. He got permission to build a gymnasium in Jerusalem, and permission for the citizens of Jerusalem, if they wanted to be considered citizens of Antioch. So very Greek in his thinking. And so we have Onias, Jason, and then Menelaus. So Jason bribed Antiochus Epiphanes to let him be high priest instead of his brother Onias. And then Menelaus, who worked for Jason, who was bringing the tribute from Jason to Antiochus, offered Antiochus even more than Jason had to give the high priesthood to him. So Onias the Hebrew, Jason the Hellenist, and Menelaus the downright unqualified and power hungry. So Jason, after Menelaus took over, became an exile. He moved out. And Menelaus had Onias, the original person who should have been high priest, murdered. So right now the two contestants for the high priesthood are Menelaus, who currently is, and Jason. And with that being the political situation in Israel, Antiochus, for the second time in his career, his first expedition into Egypt went very, very well. His second expedition started out very well also. He started at the bottom, kind of conquered his way up, got all the way up almost to Alexandria. And before, the first time he had defeated Egypt, he had left the Ptolemies in charge to avoid a negative response from Rome. He wanted to at least give the impression that they were two separate kingdoms, that he wasn't really the one in charge. But this time, Ptolemy contacted the Roman Senate, and they came to Egypt's rescue. They sent a general down there whom Antiochus knew from his time in Rome, and he basically told Antiochus, you can get out of Egypt or you can go to war with Rome. That's the situation. So Antiochus was forced to retreat, leaving a campaign that had been very successful, very promising, uncompleted, feeling very humiliated and frustrated on his way back into the land. And let's go to our sheet at this point. At the top of page 1 there, from 2nd Maccabees. About this time, Antiochus made his second invasion of Egypt, which we just talked about. And it happened that over all the city, talking about Jerusalem, for almost 40 days, there appeared golden-clad horsemen charging through the air, in companies fully armed with lances and drawn swords. Troops of horsemen drawn up, attacks and counterattacks made on this side and that, brandishing of shields, massing of spears, hurling of missiles, the flash of golden trappings and armor of all sorts. Therefore, everyone prayed that the apparition might prove to be a good, or to have been a good omen. So people had visions of heavenly armies fighting in the sky, basically, around Jerusalem. And as I mentioned last time, the book of 2nd Maccabees is often less trusted than 1st Maccabees. It does have more reference to miraculous things like this. It's more religiously focused. But the fact that 1st Maccabees doesn't have reference to those things doesn't necessarily make it more reliable. Excuse me. And we'll talk a little more about this later and the difference between them. But the long story short is that 1st Maccabees, it's much more of a secular history. It was written almost certainly by a Sadducee. Sadducees don't tend to like the supernatural, don't believe in angels, don't believe in the resurrection. And they were the ones in political power through most of the time after this. The book of 2nd Maccabees was written by a Pharisee, somebody who believed in the supernatural, believed in the resurrection. And one of the big points that he makes in the book of 2nd Maccabees is that Judas Maccabeus believed in the resurrection, or he wouldn't have done some of the things he did, and that it was belief in the resurrection that brought the people of Israel through this time. A rumor grew up that Antiochus was killed, that he had died in Egypt. And when a false rumor arose that Antiochus was dead, Jason took no less than 1,000 men and suddenly made an assault upon the city, thinking this is his chance to reclaim the high priesthood, to undo what Antiochus had done, to make things right. When the troops upon the wall had been forced back, and at last the city was being taken, Menelaus took refuge in the citadel, the more fortified part of the city. But Jason kept relentlessly slaughtering his fellow citizens, not realizing that success at the cost of one's kindred is the greatest misfortune, but imagining that he was setting up trophies of victory over enemies and not over compatriots. He did not gain control of the government, however, and in the end got only disgrace from his conspiracy and fled again into the country of the Ammonites. So he came into the city, started killing people, thinking he's doing a good thing, thinking people will be happy that he did this, not realizing all he did was kill a lot of Israelites, people that he should have been, um, yeah, friends with and not seeing as enemies. And he wasn't able, with the force he had, to actually succeed, to actually take the city, and was forced to retreat. So he accomplished absolutely nothing good with this rebellion. and he accomplished a lot of harm. He was, in a way, revolting against Antiochus's authority. He was taking advantage of the fact that he thought Antiochus was dead to go directly against the decision Antiochus had made, trying to overthrow the leader that Antiochus had installed. So, raging inwardly, Antiochus left Egypt and took the city of Jerusalem by storm. He treated it as a city that was in revolt against him. Remember, he's in a really foul mood here right after his experience in Egypt. Then there was killing of young and old, destruction of women and children, and slaughter of virgins and infants. Antiochus took the holy vessels with his polluted hands and swept away with profane hands the votive offerings that other kings had made to enhance the glory and honor of the place. So he took the treasure out of the temple, killed a lot of people, and left. And from First Maccabees, Second Maccabees talks about this too in a little more detail. But 2 years later, the king sent to the cities of Judah a chief collector of tribute, and he came to Jerusalem with a large force. So this was only the beginning of the trouble that Jerusalem experienced with Antiochus after this point. And deceitfully, this chief collector spoke peaceable words to the people of Jerusalem, and they believed him. But he suddenly fell upon the city, dealt it a severe blow, and destroyed many people of Israel. He plundered the city, burned it with fire, and tore down its houses and its surrounding walls. And they took captive the women and children and took possession of the cattle. Then they fortified the city of David with a great strong wall and strong towers, and it became their citadel. It was actually in the middle of a military parade. He marched his soldiers in front of the people. A lot of people came out to watch, and in the midst of that procession, the soldiers began killing the people on either side of them that had come out to see. And with that treachery, took military control of the city, tore down the outer city walls, strengthened the inner portion, the city of David, that strong section of Jerusalem that, if you remember way back when Jerusalem was first taken by David, the Jebusites that were there said, even the blind and the lame could defend this place against you. And David got in through the waterways. But in that way, the Seleucids made it impossible for Jerusalem to defend itself against them. They controlled the city. So on the second page there, not long after this, the king sent an Athenian or Antiochian senator to compel the Jews to forsake the laws of their fathers and cease to live by the laws of God. And this was, it seems to be a broader thing than something that just affected Israel. This is a new policy that he put in place all over his kingdom, that people needed to start adopting Greek culture as theirs. He tried to Hellenize his entire kingdom. And specifically the people of Israel, they were the ones that resisted the most strongly to this Greek influence. So he sent a senator to compel them to forsake the laws of their fathers and cease to live by the laws of God, and also to pollute the temple in Jerusalem and call it the temple of Olympian Zeus, and to call the temple in Gerizim the temple of Zeus, the friend of strangers, as did the people who dwelt in that place. So he made both the Jerusalem temple and the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim temples to Zeus, Greek temples. The altar was covered with abominable offerings that were forbidden by the laws. No one could either keep the Sabbath or observe the feasts of his fathers, or so much as confess to being a Jew. So, of course, the offerings to God stopped, and the festivals that required people to travel to Jerusalem could not be practiced at this time. And they weren't allowed even to confess to being a Jew. Judaism itself became illegal. On the monthly celebration of the king's birthday, the Jews were taken under bitter constraint and made to partake of the sacrifices. They were forced to eat unclean meat that had been sacrificed to idols. Specifically, many of them were given pig's flesh and told to eat it or they would die. And when the feast of Dionysus came, they were compelled to walk in the procession in honor of Dionysus, wearing wreaths of ivy. Dionysus was the Greek god of fertility and wine. Very immoral practices went on with the worship of him. In the 145th year, they erected a desolating sacrilege upon the altar of whole burnt offering. And that's either a reference to an altar or an idol to Zeus on the altar of burnt offering, or to the offerings themselves that were being sacrificed. They also built altars in the surrounding cities of Judah and burned incense at the doors of the houses and in the streets. The books of the law that they found, they tore to pieces and burned with fire. Where the book of the covenant was found in the possession of anyone, or anyone adhered to the law, the decree of the king condemned him to death. So Antiochus actively tried to stamp out Judaism in the most violent and brutal way imaginable. Daniel chapter 11, verses 31 and 32. This is talking about Antiochus. Daniel 11:31. So in the last verse, if you remember, it says, starting in verse 29, at the appointed time he will return and come into the south, but this time it will not happen the way it did before, talking about his second invasion of Egypt. Indeed, ships of Kittim will come against him, therefore he will be disheartened and will return and become indignant at the Holy Covenant and take action. So he will come back and show regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. So there are two ways of viewing this whole event, this war that occurred, that we're going to see begin next week. It's either a war for independence of the Jews against the Seleucids, but you could also see it very much as a civil war within Judea, between the Hebrews and the Hellenists, between the Jews that wanted to be traditional and the Jews that wanted to be Greek, who actually sided with Antiochus. And it was both of those things. There were both of those elements going on at once. So not all of the Jews opposed Antiochus. He showed regard for those who forsook the Holy Covenant. They were on his side. But in verse 31, mighty forces from him will stand, profane the sanctuary fortress, and abolish the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. And by smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. But the people who know their God will display strength and take action. Second Maccabees records a few stories from this time of people who resisted the efforts of Antiochus to get them to abandon Jewish ways. One of these people, Eleazar, it says in Second Maccabees, one of the scribes in high position, a man now advanced in age and of noble presence, was being forced to open his mouth to eat swine's flesh. But he, welcoming death with honor rather than life with pollution, went up to the rack of his own accord, spitting out the flesh, as men ought to go who have the courage to refuse things that it is not right to taste, even for the natural love of life. Those who were in charge of that unlawful sacrifice took the man aside because of their long acquaintance with him. So even people, the people who were involved in forcing their fellow Jews to make these sacrifices. Okay, these aren't pagans here. These aren't Greeks. They're Hebrews who have joined that side. But because of their long acquaintance with him, they privately urged him to bring meat of his own providing, proper for him to use, and pretend that he was eating the flesh of the sacrificial meal that had been commanded by the king, so that by doing this, he might be saved from death and be treated kindly on account of his old friendship with them. Said, use a little sleight of hand, bring your own meat, pretend to eat the pork, eat your own meat instead. Save your life that way. But making a high resolve worthy of his years and according to the holy God-given law, he declared himself quickly, telling them to send him to the grave. He refused to do this. He refused to be an example to the younger men. Said, I'm old, I have only a short time to live yet anyway. I am not going to end my life by turning others away from the covenant of God. And he was beaten to death as a result. Another, and probably the most heart-wrenching story, and the story that has lived longest in the memory of the Jews as they remembered this time, was a story of a mother with 7 sons. It happened also, and we have this recorded in 2 Maccabees as well, that 7 brothers and their mother were arrested and were being compelled by the king under torture with whips and cords to eat unlawful swine's flesh. One of them, acting as their spokesman, said, "What do you intend to ask and learn from us? For we are ready to die rather than transgress the laws of our fathers." The king fell into a rage. So Antiochus was here personally, at least for part of this process. The king fell into a rage and gave orders that pans and cauldrons be heated. These were heated immediately, and he commanded that the tongue of their spokesperson be cut out, and that they scalp him and cut off his hands and feet, while the rest of the brothers and the mother looked on. When he was utterly helpless, the king ordered them to take him to the fire, still breathing, and fry him in a pan. The smoke from the pan spread widely, but the brothers and their mother encouraged one another to die nobly. And the account goes on for quite some time, with each one of these brothers in turn, from oldest to youngest, refusing to eat the meat, expressing faith in God, faith that he would raise them from the dead and that Antiochus himself would be eternally judged for this. And each one in turn was tortured and killed as their mother watched. The mother was especially admirable and worthy of honorable memory. Though she saw her 7 sons perish within a single day, she bore it with good courage because of her hope in the Lord. She encouraged them each in the language of their fathers. The Greeks didn't know what she was saying to them, but each one, as he went up, she encouraged. Filled with a noble spirit, she fired her woman's reasoning with a man's courage and said to them, I do not know how you came into being in my womb. It was not I who gave you life and breath, nor I who set in order the elements within each of you. Therefore, the Creator of the world, who shaped the beginning of mankind and devised the origin of all things, will in his mercy give life and breath back to you again, since you now forget yourselves for the sake of his laws. It was faith in the resurrection, faith that God would remake their bodies and that they would have eternal glory as a result of their present suffering, that allowed her and many of the other Jewish people at this time to withstand Antiochus's tortures. Hebrews 11:35. Hebrews 11, of course, talks about the people of faith throughout Israel's history, the examples we have to look back on to encourage us. He talks specifically about some things from the book of Daniel. Daniel is another place where we see this happening. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, saying God has power to deliver us, but even if he doesn't, we will not worship your image. Daniel refusing to pray to anyone but God and risking his life as a result. In verse 33, the author of Hebrews talks about these people who through faith conquered kingdoms, performed righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong from weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. And others, and this is almost thinking back to this period of time right here, he says, others were tortured, not accepting their release, so that they might obtain a better resurrection. And it's at this period of time that that hope became a prominent part of Israel's religion. Up until this point, really starting with Daniel and his friends, things began to shift, but the emphasis was, if you keep God's commandments, if you're faithful to him, you will live long and prosper in the land, right? And this is very clearly not true anymore. With this persecution, being faithful to God, keeping his covenant, would get you tortured and killed. And for hope in that time, the book of Daniel was very, very significant. The book of Daniel was to them what the book of Revelation will be to the people going through the tribulation. It was their message of hope. And let's go over to the end of the book in Daniel chapter 12 here. Daniel chapter 12, starting in verse 1, says, Now at that time, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will stand. And there will be a time of distress such as never happened, since there was a nation until that time. And at that time, your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued. And that's talking ultimately about the Great Tribulation. In verse 2, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but the others to reproach and everlasting contempt. And those who have insight will shine brightly like the brightness of the expanse of heaven. and those who lead many to righteousness, like the stars forever and ever. And this is the hope that they looked forward to. This is the promise they believed. Any questions about everything we've gone over today? So far we've seen those who were more passive, those who accepted their fate and simply trusted themselves to God. Next week we'll start looking at those who took a more active role and fought back against Antiochus Epiphanes and his men. The Zealots showed up, well, next week, in a way. What Judas Maccabeus and those with him started in Israel was a tradition of freedom fighters, small groups of Israelites who would rebel against the large empire and take them on. And it was a real problem to the Jewish nation later that this had happened and been successful, because it gave them a lot of false hope, a lot of false courage that they shouldn't have had, trying to do the same thing against Rome. So, but yeah, this is where that really starts. That patriotism that's willing to fight and willing to die for the freedom of God's people, for their freedom to worship God, which became corrupted later into seeing their political freedom as a right, and it being wrong to give tribute to any ruler that was not God himself. Hence, the question, is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not? That was a big deal back then. If Jesus had answered, no, it's not right, he would have basically been identifying himself with the Zealots. He would have been saying, yes, I'm one of those who wants to rebel, who believes that these should not be paid. So, yeah, that wasn't the idea here. They were very comfortable being under other governments. They had been under other governments for quite some time, as long as they did not take away their ability to worship God. But it's also because of this incident that acceptance went away, that they were okay with being ruled by another nation. They really lost their faith in empires, you could say. Any other questions before we close? All right. Father, thank you so much for the examples of the men and women of courage who have come before us, who have gone through unimaginable things. Thank you that it really doesn't matter what we go through in this life, that we have a future hope. Help us to be willing to lay down our lives, not only in a literal sense, but to be willing to put to death our own desires in exchange for future glory. To be willing to forego the pleasures of this life in exchange for eternal reward. Give us that faith. Give us that perspective. Help us to live for you this week and to honor you with our worship this morning. In Jesus' name, amen.